Welcome to Canning with Colette. Canning methods. How do you know which canner to use? In this class, I will talk about the different canning methods used when home canning and how to know which canner to use. Home canning is the process of preserving food by destroying the possibility of food spoilage that occurs naturally from the enzymes and microorganisms that develop into molds, yeast, and bacteria. There are three types of home canning: water bath canning, also known as water boiling, steam canning, and pressure canning. This is because when it comes to home canning, there are different types of foods we need to be aware of: low acid and high acid. And knowing which type of food you're canning will determine which method to use. What am I talking about? Well, let's back up and talk about foods and where they fall on what is known as the pH acidity scale. As I said, we have what are called low acid foods and high acid foods. The acidity of food affects whether you're going to use the pressure canning method, the water bath canning method, or the steam method. Here is a depiction of where various foods fall on what is called a pH acidity scale. In this particular demonstration, the pH scale goes from a strong acid with a low number like 1 all the way up to approximately 7. The alkali can actually reach up to 14, but it's not necessary to show for our purposes here. Using this scale, you can see that molds can develop and survive in an environment of a 2 and above. Yeast can develop and survive at a 3 and above. And bacteria can develop and survive at 4.6 and above. Molds and yeast are visible and non-visible fungi that grow on food. They make food inedible and even harmful to eat. Food with natural high levels of acid on the pH scale from 4.6 and below are considered high acid foods. This would be mostly fruits like lemons, strawberries, mangoes, etc. Now, low acid foods can end up on this portion of the scale if they have been pickled. For example, you may enjoy the taste of pickled carrots or pickled green beans. Carrots and green beans are actually low acid foods, but because they're going to be pickled and processed in a brine using vinegar and additional substances, the acidity is raised, turning it into a high acid food. Let's take a better look at the upper portion of this scale. When it comes to the molds and the yeast that develop on high acid foods, this upper portion of the scale depicts food placed in jars inside of a canner, filled with water, coming to a boil, and eventually reaching 212 degrees for processing. Depending on the specific food and recipe will determine the amount of time your canned food will remain in this canner boiling at that temperature. This is known as the processing time. This processing time is scientific and will adequately destroy and inactivate the natural microorganisms and enzymes that could possibly be in your jar and promote food spoilage. Before you begin canning, it is important to know your altitude. Processing times are provided in all official canning recipe books and are typically based on an altitude of an address that is at or up to 1,000 feet above sea level, and your water will then boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. However, as you increase in elevation, your water may boil at a lower temperature, and you will simply need to process your food a little longer, which will be specified in your canning book. You will learn more on how to determine your specific elevation and or altitude in upcoming classes. Now let's take a look at the other half of the chart. Foods with natural low levels of acid on the pH acidity scale from 4.6 and above are considered low acid foods. This would be, for example, a variety of vegetables like okra, beets and green beans, meats, poultry, and seafood, as well as legumes like your navy beans and your black beans, etc. These low acid foods are prone to bacteria, which is not easily killed by heat. Certain bacteria can actually thrive in the temperatures that destroy molds and yeast. In order to kill any bacteria that could be surviving in your jars, the temperature needs to be raised up to 240 degrees for an extended amount of time. The only way that temperature can be reached is with the use of a pressure canner. Just like with the high acid foods, depending on the specific food and recipe will determine the amount of time your canned food will remain in this pressure canner at the heat and pressure created inside. This is known as the processing time. The processing time is scientific and will adequately destroy and inactivate the natural microorganisms and enzymes that could be in your jar and promote food spoilage. As I stated previously, most official canning books provide recipes based on an altitude at or below 1,000 feet above sea level. If your altitude is over 1,000 feet above sea level, then you will need to adjust your processing times and or the PSI, pounds per square inch, for safe home canning. Processing times and PSI are provided in all official canning recipe books and must be adhered to for your safety. So let's talk more about these canners, in particular the water bath canner.
Alright, so we were talking about low acid and high acid foods, right? And we talked about the different canners that are used depending on which type of food you're going to be canning, right? And so I did show you a chart that helps you to determine which type of canner you would be using based on where it falls on the pH acidity scale, right? So I just wanted to actually show you what a real canner looks like, because that chart I kind of showed you was more of a drawing, so I'm going to give you a better visual. So here's one example of a water bath canner. And they come a little different. You can get them where they're all stainless steel. They can be even bigger than this, actually. So this is typically your standard water bath canner that you see often. It's also known as the boiling canner. So you'll hear the term water bath canner. You'll also hear maybe boiling canner. You may hear the water bath method. You may hear the water boiling method. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the canner that's used when canning high acid foods. And the high acid foods are going to be things that fall on the pH acidity chart at 4.6 and below. It would be things in the fruit category, typically like your apples, your plums, cherries, strawberries, lemons, anything with that high acidity 4.6 and below. All right. And so in this example of a water bath canner, it's very simply made. It's typically a large pot as such that comes with a fitting lid like this. All right. And so inside the lid, they typically also will have a rack like this. All right. And so the rack is used for supporting your jars. And so by supporting your jars, you're able to lower your jars into the canner and out of the canner. And this will prevent your jars from actually resting at the bottom of your canner. And so we don't want the jars to actually touch the bottom of the canner, because that could cause your jars to actually crack. All right, and so we don't want that. So this is definitely a safety feature for that. It also helps, to not have to maneuver with that hot boiling water that's going to be inside this canner, as we talked about. All right, and so that's what I wanted to demonstrate in this video, the famous water bath canner. And again, very simply made, large pot, rack, lid. That's it. This is your water bath canner used for canning high acid foods.
All right. And so now let's look at what is known as a steam canner.
Here is another style of a canner that can be used for canning high acid foods. Now this is referred to as the steamer or the steam canner. And it's, you don't see much about it. It's not wildly talked about, but it definitely is a canner that can be used for canning those high acid foods. It doesn't actually work the same as the water bath canner, where we fill this with water and we boil the jars. This one actually works with significantly less amount of water. As you can see, this is the actual base of the canner. And the water gets filled to about here, right? But what happens is when those, and it also has a rack, okay? This is the rack. When those jars are placed on the rack, this lid goes on. And as the heat is cranked high, it builds steam inside of it. That's why it's called the steam canner. And that steam gets super hot in there, and it reaches that same temperature, that 212 degrees temperature that is required for killing off, those natural enzymes and microorganisms that develop on those high acid foods that can cause food spoilage. And so yes, this is another style of a canner, the steam canner. I'll talk a little bit about this in some upcoming videos, but I did want to make you aware of this one as well. You don't hear a lot of people talk too much about it, but canners are starting to use this much more. You use quite a bit less water. It is very lightweight, right? And you can still put quite a bit of jars inside of here. So I believe you can get between up to 8 pint-sized jars in here, and you can get, I believe, up to 7 quart-sized jars in here. So it is definitely a canner to be used. I hope this video was helpful as to what a steam canner actually looks like.
All right, and I may have to correct myself. I believe you might be able to get actually about 9 pint-sized jars inside this canner in 7 quart-sized jars. But you definitely can get quite a few jars in there. All right, one more video about the pressure canner.
So in this video, I want to talk about the pressure canner and the different types of pressure canners. Now in this video, I'm going to be talking about 2 specific types of canners, pressure canners that are typically used. There are some other styles out there, and I will talk about those a little in some of the other videos, but I want to talk about the 2 major ones that you're probably going to come across the most. So this is one style of a pressure canner. This pressure canner uses a weighted regulator, all right, and it has several little weights on it. They each represent 5 pounds, and depending on where you live, what your altitude is, will determine how many of these you're going to put on your regulator. I'm going to talk about that in much more detail in future videos. I just wanted to give you a visual of what a pressure canner actually looks like. This is one style. And these pressure canners, unlike the water bath canner that just has a lid that comes off and on, this lid actually seals on. So, for example, when this lid is placed on, it locks in place, all right? And as we mentioned in previously, it's not the boiling method. It's going to have significantly less amount of water in it, and it builds up steam and pressure inside, and the temperatures in here can get up to between 240 and even up to 260 degrees inside the pressure canner. And so this method is the method that is used when we're canning the low acid foods, like those vegetables, carrots and green beans and potatoes, like those meats and poultries and seafoods, as well as our legumes, the navy beans, the black beans. Those are the type of foods that, because of their low acidity, have to be canned using the pressure canner. All right, and so this is one style of a pressure canner. This is another style. All right, it's larger, so that just means you can get more jars inside. It also has a dial gauge rather than the regulator that I showed you on this pressure canner. They both do the same thing, just a little differently, but they both get to those same temperatures to safely kill off the bacteria that develops on your low acid foods. All right. Same thing as far as the lid. It is a locking lid, and so you would just find the notches on here and match them up and lock it in place. Boom. All right, and that's it. Very secure. All right. They work differently. These pressure canners work differently than the water bath canner. As I stated, and I will go into much more detail in upcoming videos, but I wanted to give you a visual of what the pressure canner looks like. It also has a rack inside, I neglected to mention, and I'll show you that really quickly. It's a little different. It's just a basic rack, and it's just thick enough to keep your jars from touching the very, very bottom of the pressure canner. Very simple little rack, and that's placed in here before we add the jars. We load our jars in, we put our lid on, we seal it, and then we move ahead with the canning process. All right, so I hope that this visual was helpful to you.
All right, and I will see you in the next class. And remember, we can do this. Peace, y'all.